Money doesn't grow on trees. But chopping them down has helped lots of the world get richer.
Since the beginning of the 20th century, humans have been raiding these resources almost as though they were limitless.
The problem is, the world is now paying a heavy environmental price.
It certainly looks like a crisis after the worst drought in 80 years.
So is there a financial solution?
If we don't change the movement of money, we'll continue to finance ourselves into extinction.
Is paying for trees to be protected and restored the answer? And how do you put a price on their worth? To understand the alarming story of deforestation, let's start with Costa Rica in the 1980s.
Nunca vi a mi papá sembrando un árbol maderable.
Maria's family was typical of many. Enticed by the riches of agriculture, her father cleared and converted their forest to pasture.
Las tierras en los antepasados, por ejemplo, lo vi con mi padre. Tal vez no se le daba el valor que tenía la tierra y los recursos. Creían que eran inagotables.
Agriculture and its export market were the driving force behind deforestation. From 1940 to 1987, the proportion of land in Costa Rica covered by forest plummeted from 75% to 21%. Costa Rica's experience is far from unique. The rest of the world jumped on the bandwagon too.
Humans have been cutting trees for thousands of years, but there was a massive acceleration in the last century.
The UN estimates around 10 million hectares of forest are being lost each year. That's around 27 football fields every minute. Fewer trees means less carbon dioxide being absorbed from the atmosphere, and their destruction only adds more emissions, accelerating climate change. At the heart of this global crisis sits the world's largest rainforest and the so-called Trump of the tropics, Jair Bolsonaro.
Primeiro você tem que entender que a Amazônia é do Brasil, não é de vocês. A primeira resposta é essa daí.
From 2019 to 2022, the rate of deforestation in Brazil rose by roughly 50%, attracting critics around the world. The problem is, it's a bit rich for wealthy countries to demand that poorer ones give up the economic benefits of deforestation.
The majority of deforestation in recent years has really been driven by agricultural expansion in developing countries. It can almost seem hypocritical to criticise these developing nations for following a pathway that effectively made rich countries wealthy in previous centuries.
So, what can be done? The simple answer is for rich countries to incentivise poorer ones to protect and restore their forests. One thing the wealthy world has tried is stumping up cash for new tree planting schemes, but many of these haven't borne fruit.
Tree planting programs are incredibly popular. They can seem almost childishly easy. You plant a tree, you save the climate. The reality, of course, is nowhere near that simple. In terms of the climate, it can be far more beneficial to conserve the forest that's there.
So, another way is to focus rewards for developing countries on conserving existing forests. It works like this. Using historic rates of deforestation, a country predicts how much forest it's likely to lose in the future. Any forest that it manages to conserve is judged against this benchmark. The donor hands over a financial reward to the developing country for the trees it saved, paying a sum for each tonne of carbon dioxide that would have otherwise been emitted. It's not just the developing country that stands to gain. The donors, often rich countries or companies, can benefit too. In exchange for their money, they can claim what's called a carbon credit, which they can use to offset their emissions elsewhere.
Carbon credits are a way of allowing companies, countries, people who can't reduce their own emissions currently to offset those emissions elsewhere. They are seen as an important part of transitioning towards a net zero economy.
I started out hugging orangutans, but now I find myself hugging asset managers and bankers a bit more often.
Andrew Mitchell is a zoologist turned financial advisor. He encourages investors to buy carbon credits and believes they are an important tool for forest conservation.
These credits are hugely valuable. It's a transition strategy. Whilst you're reducing your carbon emissions, you have to buy offsets. You should buy offsets.
It sounds like a win-win, but so far the results are mixed. Shady players have gamed the system and pulled dirty tricks, like duplicating credits, or claiming to conserve land never under threat, or moving the problem to the forest next door.
Built into the Paris Agreement is this consensus that there should be a global scheme for exchanging carbon credits across borders. In practice, the rules and standards that would govern such a global market have been incredibly difficult to establish. And so right now, what we've got is a system which is really unregulated.
And although standards and the scale of carbon credit schemes are improving, there's still one big sticking point. The rewards for conserving trees still lag behind those for deforesting.
We need carbon markets to grow. They won't really achieve their full potential unless the price of offsetting a ton of carbon is competitive with the profits that can be generated from other activities on that land. Ultimately, conservation has to become profitable.
Re-enter Costa Rica. Once the poster child of deforestation, but now a global leader in conservation, and an example of how to make saving nature pay. Here, landowners are paid by the government to restore and conserve forests, and this has helped to create new and sustainable economic opportunities.
Económicamente o calidad de vida la tenemos mucho mejor que anteriormente.
Remember Maria, whose father made a living out of chopping down trees. Like many in Costa Rica, her family have since branched out, and now do the very opposite.
Hola, mi amor, qué dicha que vinieron. ¿Cómo están mis corazones?
Maria and her grandchildren replant forests. So far, 350 hectares worth. The government pays them, and many other families, around $80 a year for each hectare of forest that's restored or kept intact.
Nosotros iniciamos con poca tierra, pero gracias a esos dineritos que recibimos se fue comprando más terreno y se fue comprando otro poquito más. Agradezco mucho al Fondo Nacional Forestal, al Estado, a todo aquel que hizo posible que empezáramos.
It might sound like a government subsidy scheme, but here's the key bit. It's not. It's a system known as Payments for Environmental Services, launched in the late 90s. It's paid for by citizens, who are seen as benefiting from the services provided by healthy forests, like carbon storage, the protection of vital food chains, and clean water.
The money is not coming from the national budget. The money comes from those who benefit.
Carlos Manuel Rodriguez is Costa Rica's former environment minister and the brains behind the scheme, which is paid for by a levy on consumers' water bills and a tax on their fuel use.
Costa Rica was the first developing country that put a tax on carbon to generate a revenue for the payment of environmental services. Everybody who uses fuel in Costa Rica and pollutes the environment contributing to climate change must pay in the price of purchasing that fuel an extra amount that goes to this forest fund that pays farmers.
So far, the scheme has invested more than $500 million in the conservation of forests. And it's paid off. In the space of a generation, forest cover in Costa Rica jumped from 21% to more than 50%. With the restoration of trees have come new opportunities for profitable and sustainable industries, blowing away the idea that conservation and economic development are always at loggerheads.
Nature-based tourism has become an extremely important source of jobs in rural Costa Rica, as opposed to what we had in the past, which was this irrational, unsustainable agricultural production. There is no dichotomy between preservation and economic development.
Since 1987, the peak of deforestation in Costa Rica, the country's GDP has risen by an average of 4.2% a year. Costa Rica isn't a magic formula for saving the world's forests. Since it began prioritising conservation, it's increased food imports, an option not available to all countries. But there is a lot Costa Rica can teach others. For one thing, it's improved some of its bad spending habits, reversing subsidies that incentivise the clearance of land at all costs. A lead more countries should follow.
We should put more money into the protection of nature from governments, but the reality is, even if we doubled all that money, it wouldn't come close to beating the subsidies that directly cause harm to nature.
Each year, the world spends around $150 billion on protecting nature, but around 12 times that on subsidies that harm it. Some campaigners argue a more radical fix is needed to save the volume of forests necessary to avert environmental catastrophe. They say what's required is a fundamental shift away from society's focus on profits and growth.
The problem with GDP is that it measures everything we build and nothing that we protect. That's all beginning to change now. People are waking up to the importance of keeping nature going to keep our economy going.
Not everyone supports such a drastic change to economic thinking, but most do agree that change is not happening fast enough, with the eyes of many global leaders on other challenges.
The world is facing multiple crises. In the midst of all this, there's a risk that nature conservation and the climate crisis are demoted in the pecking order. But climate change, the global climate, does not wait for short-term crises to pass.
Me siento muy orgullosa de cuidar el bosque. Lo hemos visto con nuestros hijos, lo hemos visto ya ahora con nuestros nietos.
Paying for the services trees provide is not a silver bullet that will reverse climate change. The world needs to urgently reduce industrial emissions and prioritise policies to decarbonise economies. But unless trees are worth more alive than dead, deforestation and its devastation will continue.
I'm Tom Standage, Deputy Editor of The Economist and Editor of The World Ahead. To read more of our future-gazing coverage, click on the link. Thanks for watching and don't forget to subscribe.